For this week of the podcast, I got to sit down with creative writer and my former teacher, Ben Greene. For my first class with him, I always found Ben to be a fascinating person with a very unique mind. In this discussion, we go over various topics related to art, including spirituality, creative needs, and the writing process. We played at the Jazz Vespers things a couple
Right.
times, and I
Yeah.
was wondering, do you see a tight connection between sort of spirituality and the art making process? Like, is it at the end of art you end up in like the realm of the gods or something?
Well, uh, that's a really interesting question. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but I do think that there is a divining process. You know how divining also, of course, is used for finding water, right? Like a divining rod is
Oh, I
is
didn't know
a
that.
divining rod is a bent stick that people use will walk around with, or look this up later, but people, I think of Irish people doing this, although I don't think it's limited to that. I think it's an old, perhaps pagan custom that there are certain sticks that are bent a certain way, and they're called divining rods. And if you walk around with in a field somewhere, you could actually, or the woods, you can find sources of water through the way that the stick will lead you or bend you, and it's called a divining rod. So and apparently it's not just a bunch of hooey, although I mean I can't substantiate the scientific nature of it, but I think people have found water sources through divining rods. Why? I'm not sure. So I think there is a certain uh, search for sources that happens through the artistic process that could be um, described as a uh, uh, search for the gods or God in a sense. So I think there could be a mystical experience that happens through art form for sure, and I think a number of artists reflect that. Although I wouldn't necessarily say that's true of all of them.
Sure, yeah. Um, yeah, I think even like phenomenologically, like when you're, I don't know, playing your music or really into the writing process, there's this some weird shiny meaning feeling that's going on, right?
Well, there is a sense of connection, isn't there? I mean, even when you're playing solo, and I mean, you would know this better than I. Playing with other musicians, I've heard it described this way that when um, when it is really working best, it's not just that you're communicating with each other, but you're kind of linked into a common source. It's almost as if the music itself is calling you to serve it as best as possible, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
And and when and when it really works well, you realize, hey, we were locked in there, and it wasn't, and it was partly, yes, we were communicating with each other, but it was really almost as if the music took us over and used us as a conduit. So I think that definitely has a that element to it, and I do think that's also the case with solo. I mean, definitely with. I mean, not that I have the skill to even just playing my guitar um, by myself. Sometimes I feel like a whatever I'm playing has kind of taken over me, and I'm in the groove, so to speak. And I think that definitely happens with writing too. Sometimes you feel that you've reached the level or the part of the path where it's all smooth and you're being led rather than uh, scrambling or scrabbling your way through.
Yeah. There's definitely that those points where it feels like something is acting on you, where you're no longer really
Yeah.
in charge or initiating anything. It's kind of like it's coming out of you in a way, or yeah,
Right. Yeah.
very
Well,
curious.
yeah, I mean, that sort of goes back to the first question, but do you know John Lee Hooker?
I've heard of him, but haven't listened to
Yeah, the
anything.
blues musician. He has a song called uh, I don't know if it's called "Let That Boy Boogie Woogie." I'll find out the title, but
Sure.
where he's describing himself as a kid who is compelled to play, and as I recall in the song, the mother is puzzled by the young blues musician's um, uh, compulsion to play, but somebody tells the mother, uh, "Let that boy boogie woogie. It's in him. It's got to come out." and and that's kind of what we're both talking about here, and we're talking about at the beginning. Sometimes you feel like it's got to, you have to release it somehow, but it's not, as we've indicated, not always necessarily an internal emotional release. It's sometimes it's um, there's a sense of the other that's involved.
With your fiction pieces, or like short
Yeah.
stories or longer forms, are you
Mhm.
much of a planner, or do you kind of just go spontaneously and hope for the best? Or
I've started stories where I don't know where they're going. I mean, I think of one example of a story that it just began with a little phrase that hinted at a character that led to a whole unfolding of a story that I had no idea where it was going. Then some stories, I know I want to write about this incident or this situation, and again, I don't plan them out. But of the last three stories that I completed, two of them I had to actually do some plotting for, where I have to number the sequence of this is going to happen, then this is going to happen, then this is going to happen, which is not my usual modus operandi, mo. Um, uh, but in the cases of those two stories, it was very helpful, and I think yielded some good results. Yeah, and in one of the cases, it was I had all this material that I wanted to include, but I didn't know how to best deploy that material to optimal effect. Right? I want to include this and this and this and this, but what order do I? And it was jumping back and forth in time. So what order do I put it in that's going to serve my purposes best? In another case, it was I need to figure out what's going to happen here and what could lead to what. I had some glimmers of what I wanted to occur, but I really wasn't sure how to make it work. And so I actually mapped it out in advance. And
Mhm.
in the novel that I wrote, there was some kind of some of both. I knew some of what I wanted, but eventually I needed to I needed to figure out, okay, where's this going to go? And I had to do some organizing.
Yeah, I think another thing that sometimes comes up is not really knowing how your writing will be sort of read. Like, because writing, it takes a lot of time, and you might think you've included enough because it's taking you X amount of hours to write all those passages. But then as a reader, you can go through the passage much quicker, right? And so then
Sure.
maybe you feel there's not enough detail. How
Right.
do you go about ensuring that what you've written will be sort of match what you think a reader will read?
Right. Well, I don't think it can exactly.
Sure.
that's the tricky part, of course, is you know what you're going for, and sometimes you think, "Wow, that's good." It's subtle, but it's good. But um, and then and it might, and the concern becomes, will people pick up on what I'm going for here? I don't know that there's any surefire way. I mean, first of all, you have to some extent, write to please your own artistic intentions and standards, because chances are that there will be someone, it may not be a broad audience, but there will be others that will be able to appreciate it at that level. And I think I think you can't, unless you're totally bent on making money. I don't think you can try to tailor your art to the tastes of a broad public that you're not even aware of, you haven't even met. I do think, and I can't say that I have this, but I do think it's useful to run things by a trusted individual that you think is perceptive enough to, or individuals. Ideally, you've got several that you say, "Hey, what do you think of this?" and 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 you want some sort of response. But I mean, that was the advantage in that university setting that I was telling you about. The creative writing program is you get an audience uh, built in to hear some things. And but anyway, if you have some people that you can say, "Hey, check this out, tell me your reactions." I mean, what you're hoping for ultimately is praise, but it's you're you I think if you have an integrity as an artist, you're really wanting a response that's going to be straightforward, honest enough that if the reader or the audience for a piece of music is going to serve you well, they will say, "Hey, I liked this, but this part I don't know, or I didn't understand this, or I thought that the ending didn't work so well." I think some artists are confident enough in their own vision that they don't really mind if most people don't get it, because they know, hey, I know what I'm going for here, and if all of you don't get it, I still know that it's good. Now, of course, I suppose that happens with mediocre artists too, that think, "Hey, this is great," and they're told otherwise, and they say, "Well, but I'm a genius and you're not." um, yeah. But I think it would be helpful to have. This is a long answer to a short question, but I think it would be helpful to have people that you can run things by, that might see what their reaction is.
So I guess at the end of the day, you still kind of go with your gut instinct, but then do try to workshop a little bit to like get
Yeah.
into people's heads more. And what did most of you guys do post like after graduate school or?
Oh, well. Most of them went into teaching, basically, and I think many of them continued. You know, I the ones that I know continued to write. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I was just curious a little bit about like
Sure.
what kind of paths are open to people to post.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I could think of an exotic one, I would tell you. Can't at the moment.
Like a snake charmer or something.
Well, that's what poetry is, right? Snake charming.
Wait, how did you end up in Victoria then? Or
Okay. That's a good one. Through Jim, he had a pal named Larry that they had gone to high school together, and Larry came to visit us in Greensboro. I met Larry through Jim, and there's a whole nother circle of eccentric friends there that I met through Larry, and eventually when Jim was living in Denver, Larry and I one summer took a long road trip in a Volkswagen minivan, and we rode across the United States, basically following the Rockies. I mean, we spent some time with Jim in Denver, carried on going up into the Rockies and into the Canadian Rockies, and eventually wound up on Vancouver Island. We were just looking for national parks and beautiful places to camp and, you know, experience life. And we had, both of us were involved in education. I at that point was working through the South Carolina Arts Commission as a poet in residence. They had an artist in residence program, and so a number of different artists of a wide range of genres were contracted to teach in the schools for anywhere from 1 week to 12 weeks. So I was working as an itinerant poet in the schools for a while. So I had the summer off. Larry was in education. He was a high school teacher, art teacher, and he was in education. So we traveled across the state, spent some time with Jen, wound up on Vancouver Island and camped at Long Beach, and wound up camping at a camp. At the time, you could camp on the beach, actually, but we camped next to where a group of 3 women were camping, and we met them, and one of them eventually became my wife. And so through the connection with her, I, stayed in contact with Vancouver Island. I continued to work in the States, but spent the summers here. And then we got married, and we lived in the States for 2.5 years, but we moved back in her case, me for the first time, moved to the Victoria area, and I took a year of getting what's called a PDPP, post-degree. I already had my master's degree in creative writing. But in order to teach in Canada, I needed a year, basically at the time it was a year of upgrade or topping up, so to speak. So I spent a year doing that and then became a teacher here.
I just interviewed Joey Smith a few weeks ago, and he
Oh
was
yeah,
also on the road with the Glenn Miller Orchestra, and they
right.
just happened to be in like at a radio station here in Victoria, and then the
Oh,
announcer is now his wife.
oh, okay.
It's kind of
Yeah, see,
sweet.
that's what Americans do. They come here and charm Canadians, but yeah, that's ironic, isn't it? And then, but they wind up, but note where they end up, right? They don't move there.
Let's talk a little bit about like the creative urge. Like, what do you think is responsible for that in artists? Like, why do they do what they do?
Well, there is a certain compulsion to do it,
Right.
and I think there's um, it's I won't say it's because they have no choice, because sometimes we fight it, fight it all, or we slough off the call, so to speak. But it is a sort of feeling that I this I can only express myself this way, and so I'm going to express myself this way, and but there's I mean, it's often a struggle, but there's a satisfaction in it that is worth the effort. So, and as you advance in an art form, you feel like you know what you're doing better than you did when you started. And so I think there is a sense, I think urge is a good term for it. There is a sense of, this is the terrible analogy here, but I thought about how and this probably is going to be a part you want to cut out, but I thought about how serial killers occasionally will feel like I've got to kill somebody, or I'm not going to rest easy. Um, um, so
So we're
it's
like
different.
that.
It's different, though. I think there's no victims that I'm aware of in fulfilling the creative urge. So I think it's just you feel that you feel something that attracts you to a particular mode of expression, and you feel like I've got to see where this takes me, and I really want to finish this because I enjoy the process. I I enjoy the process of creating a piece of art. I mean, for whatever it's worth, right?
Yeah, and so if we think of that as an urge, do you see there being like inspiration is often brought up? Are there particular moments where you're more motivated to create artwork, or like what is it usually associated with that you end up feeling this urge?
Well, it's
Kind of random, or
yeah,
it's
yeah.
not like all the time you want to make something, right? Or
No, no, but I think there's something to be said about daily engagement. Not that I can claim to meet that goal, but um, what's the spark, so to speak? It can vary so much. Sometimes, in my case, a particular word captures my attention, or a particular phrase captures my attention, and I think, oh, that's an interesting word, or oh, that's an interesting phrase, and then it can it can spin out into and I often recognize early on, oh, that would be good in a song, or that would be good in a poem, or occasionally that I can see that as being part of a story. So that little germ of an idea um, gets planted, so to speak, and then I see where it takes me. Now, it's also true, and less so now than it used to be. It's also true that I start a number of things that I don't complete, but uh, I mean, I have more ideas than I seem to fulfill. I don't think that's uncommon, but I don't quite anymore have the that sense of abandoning works as readily as I used to.
I usually try to ask people like maybe some like favorite writers, favorite influences artistically
Sure.
towards the end, if you wanted to list some names or talk about certain works.
Okay.
Sure.
Um,
Kind of putting you on the spot there, but
no, that's no. It could take another hour on that, but
yeah.
well, favorite writers. Well, so many, but Nabokov. Um, his prose is just so luscious, and that I think uh, not that well, very few people would write like that. And another prose stylist and just um, writer of genius is Marcel Proust. Um, I think in terms of characterization and just general unfolding of a story and richness of atmosphere, I think Dickens. Let's see. Lately, I've been really taken with the work of Iris Murdoch. I think she really engages questions of art and sex and purpose. And she was a philosopher as well, so I think she's a very interesting writer. Henry James. I mean, I tend to be drawn to people that have. This wouldn't be the case with Iris Murdoch, but I tend to be drawn to writers that have something of an elaborate writing style that are, although I do admire the simplicity and clean prose of other writers. I mean, a fairly recent discovery for me is Willa Cather. Her prose, I think, is lucid and beautiful. Wow, there are scores of others I could say. That's a quick short list. I'm trying to think. In poetry, and Wallace Stevens, he's challenging and difficult, but I think um, certainly interesting. Someone like, let me think, Theodore Roethke, Roethke, was always something of an inspiration for me, and Yeats, W.B. Yeats, and um, Emily Dickinson. Yeah, there are lots actually.